So these are the notes for 11.3. Now that we know a lot of different methods to solve our quadratic equations, like factoring, completing the square quadratic formula, so now we're going to use those different types of ways to solve quadratic equations to help us with other problems. So factoring is going to be a big thing that we're going to see here. So if we look at this first problem, I think probably the way that I would want to go ahead and solve this one is by using my square root property. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to get the radical alone on one side. So now I'm looking at this because it's negative. Let's go ahead and let's put it on the other side. And then it'll become positive now that the radical's alone. So we're using things that we learned when we did radicals in chapter 10. We can square both sides. So the right-hand side is going to give me, x minus 1. And the left-hand side, now I'm going to have to FOIL this out, is going to give me x squared minus 6x plus 9. Because it's quadratic, I'm going to have to take everything over and set it equal to 0. So I'm going to get x squared. I'm going to subtract the x, so it's going to be minus 7x. And then I'm going to add the 9, so that's going to give me plus 10 is equal to 0. So here we're at the point where we have to use those quadratic ways of solving our equations because this is a quadratic equation. I'm thinking this one's going to factor, which is of course something you always want to try first because factoring is certainly the easiest way to solve them. So this will factor into x minus 5 times x minus 2. So we're going to get two answers when we set them equal to 0. We'll get x equals 5, and we'll get x equals 2. Now let's just take a quick minute, and let's check these into our original equation. So let's check a 5. So let's see, if I plug a 5 into here, 5 minus 1 is 4. The square root of 4 is 2. So I would have 5 minus 2, which is 3, minus 3 is 0. So the 5 checks. So we'll go ahead and box that. Let's see about the 2 though. The 2 is questionable. So this would be 2 minus, if I plug a 2 in here, I'm going to get 1. 2 minus 1 is 1, but then 1 minus 3 is not 0. So this solution does not check. I was afraid of that. Okay, so the next one's a rational equation. And remember we reviewed these when we did B5, I believe, or it could have been B1 or B4, but somewhere in there. So remember the idea is that you want to eliminate all of the fractions, and we're going to do that by multiplying every term by the lowest common denominator. The lowest common denominator of all of the denominators would be x times x minus 1. So now when I multiply every term in this equation through by my lowest common denominator, all my denominators should cancel. So you can see when I do this first term, the x minus 1s will cancel, which is going to leave me 2x times x, which is 2x squared, minus, here, when I do this one, my x's are going to cancel, which is going to leave me with the x plus 2 on the top times the x minus 1. We're going to have to FOIL that. Is equal to, on the right-hand side, it's easy. Everything cancels, and we're simply left with 5. All right, so let's go ahead. Let's FOIL this out. We're going to get x squared. Outside I get negative 1x, inside I get 2x, so that's going to give me plus x minus 2. Let's distribute through the negative 1, so negative x squared minus x plus 2 is equal to 5. When we subtract 2x squared minus x squared, we're going to be left with x squared. So we're going to have a quadratic. So we'll bring over the 5. So it's going to be x squared minus the x. And then when I subtract 5 from the 2, I'm going to get minus 3 is equal to 0. Let's just go ahead really quickly and make sure we're doing okay, because I'm not feeling great about having to solve this. I don't see any mistakes, do you? Gives me x squared. Why am I not liking this? Because look, this doesn't factor. So what do I have to do to be able to solve it? Well, I could use completing the square, but that means I would have to take half of 1 and square it, and I'm just not feeling working with all of those fractions right now. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use my quadratic formula. So remember, quadratic formula is negative b, so that'd be 1 plus and minus the square root of negative 1 squared is 1 minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Well, to finish this off, we're going to get 1 plus and minus. This is going to be 1 plus 12, or 13 over 2. So there's our two answers. Now remember, the only time that an answer will not check is if when I plug it into the denominator, it gives me a 0, and certainly none of these solutions will give me a 0. So we're done with that example.